So good evening and welcome everyone to Matriarch Illuminations, the first of a 5-part series hosted by Jessica Wood. It is my great pleasure to welcome you. My name is Tamara Baldwin. I'm the Acting Assistant Director for the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous land that I am on today. And because we're on a virtual platform, I'd like to invite you to acknowledge the Indigenous land that you are on today. I myself am an uninvited settler, and I'm on the unceded and stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I offer immense gratitude and thanks to the nations and the Indigenous peoples who have been the protectors of the lands and the waters that house and nourish my family. And I commit to taking responsibility for past and present harms, to listen, to learn, and to do the work that's incumbent upon me to do. As I said a moment ago, it's my great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce you to Jessica Wood. Jessica Wood is known as Si Sityaawks, a woman who creates change. And spending any time with her, there is no debate that that is the best and most appropriate name for her. Jessica Wood is the second Policy Practitioner Fellow to join the UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and the creator of this series. She joined in June 2020, and we are very grateful to have you with us, Jessica. Thank you. Jessica's from the Gitxsan and Tsimshian nations with extended roots to the Tahltan and Nisga'a Nations. She's currently serving, although not tonight, to be clear, as the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Reconciliation, Transformation and Strategies Division with the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation for the province of BC. Jessica is leading British Columbia's cross-ministry work to adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, known as the Declaration, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of Canada's calls to action and learnings from the relevant case law, such as the Chilkwa decision. As part of this transformation, she's led, in the collaboration with First Nations Leadership Council, the development of the legislation to implement the UN Declaration in provincial law. The declaration legislation received royal assent in November of 2019 with unanimous support from all sides of the House, affirming the minimum standards of the survival, dignity, and well-being of the Indigenous peoples in what is known as British Columbia. Currently, her division is leading in the development of the provincial action plan to support implementation. Jessica is also known as an experienced community developer whose portfolios have focused on issues related to race relations, residential school, sexual health, sex work, Indigenous women, and gendered violence. She was the first Indigenous woman in Canada whose work as a municipal social planner focused solely on the health and safety of sex workers and impacted communities, gendered and racialized violence, and the prevention of youth sexual exploitation. I'm so pleased to turn it over to Jessica and to have the opportunity to listen and to learn with you this evening. Thank you.
I'm Si Sityaawks by you. Thank you, Tamara, for that really warm introduction into the UBC School of Policy and Global Affairs for having me join you as a fellow. I'm honored to be joining you from the territory of the Saanich, Cowichan, and Chemainus First Nations here on Salt Spring Island. And I am also pleased to be joined by Professor Patricia Barcaskis. Tonight is the first in a series of 5 where you will witness meditations on different parts of matriarchy and how that may engage with policy and with law. And often we talk about who gets to sit at the table, and that is a symbol of power. That is where decisions are made. That is how policy and law come to be. And tonight we're going to invite you to sit at our table. Of course, virtually, given the safety protocols that we're all doing our best to adhere to. And so we're doing so virtually. I'd like to acknowledge and invite Professor Patricia Barcaskis, who is Métis from Alberta. Her research focuses on the intersection of justice and law, including access to justice, clinical legal education, and decolonizing an Indigenous law. She's particularly interested in examining the value of Indigenous pedagogies in experiential learning, clinical legal education, and in skills-based legal training while disrupting the normative violence of colonial legal education. She is the academic director for the Indigenous Community Legal Clinic, which is located on the downtown east side, in the downtown east side community in Vancouver on the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I think it's poignant for her to join us tonight as we get started, particularly given the focus of Indigenous-led justice and representation within their own legal experience. She is also the faculty lead for the Allard School of Law's Indigenous Cultural Competency Certificate. And I have known Professor Barkaskas, I've known Patricia since my undergrad when we were both at UVic together, and we've had many different shared or tangent experiences of working through Indigenous history, residential school settlement agreement, and now experiences through law and justice. So I'm honored to have her join us here today, and I will invite Patricia to join in the conversation. I will, of course, need to have a couple of official technical difficulties while I fight with my technology to be able to see you. There we go.
No
Welcome,
worries.
Patricia.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. It's really an honor. I'm joining you today from the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. Of course, they're unceded ancestral lands. I am currently located sort of by Vancouver, up by Vancouver's City Hall here in what is now known as Vancouver. And I think it's always important for me as I look at that symbol of colonial history that marks the landscape right in front of the mountains behind it, of which I've heard some incredible stories about their Indigenous legal significance and names. Sorry, I also have cats I'm trying to keep out of the screen. That these two things stand in sharp contrast for me every day as I look at them. And as Jessica said, I am Métis from Alberta. My family hails from the communities of Lac Saint Anne and Lac La Biche, with intergenerational ties back to Red River and some other important Métis communities and settlements as well in Saskatchewan and what is now Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And it's just a real honor to be here today with you, Jessica. As you indicated, our journeys have been, our journeys have sort of been in relationship throughout the last 20 years.
I know. I know, right?
It's a long time.
I tried not to count because my youngest is in university, so having these kind of adventures with others. Yeah, it's been through many things. I think one of the places to start is like, where are we now compared to where we were 20 years ago? You know, there's been so many things that have happened. There was the provincial inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women long before there was a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. There's been the hearings for residential school survivors. There was the largest settlement agreement in Canadian history, the largest court-mandated reconciliation process in global history. And then all of the hearings that came with the TRC. Of course, through there, you did your graduate degree and then went to law school. And when I think back to our younger selves as younger Indigenous women in university and what avenues were available to us and what we were talking about then, so much of it is still relevant. where do you think we are now? I guess is my question is, if we're sitting around together, we often talk about how we got here and what's important to that. It's important to know how we've gotten here on this journey. Métis people have legal recognition as Indigenous people. And for many of those who are watching, that might be new information, but we're still fighting, from my perspective, on the recognition of our existence.
Every day. Yeah, it's pretty amazing when I think about how much has changed since those early days and those conversations. Some things haven't, you know, we're still at a kitchen table. I mean, or at least I am, and we're still drinking tea, and we're, you know, still visiting in what ways we can, and still having these conversations about who we are and where we are and why we, my cat just fell, that was scary, I'm sorry. And why it's so important that we are sitting here having this conversation, and why it's so significant, and why perhaps it shouldn't be. You know, in a world where we're dreaming, in a world where we're dreaming about what it means for Indigenous women to be sitting at these tables, tables that we sit at together, talking about the things that we talk about, but sitting at the tables of government, sitting at the tables of the law, sitting at the tables of, you know, huge institutions like universities and other systemic structures that uphold the colonial system. The ways that that's profound, and yet really, you know, as you said, I think it was yesterday, right? Really shouldn't be.
Wasn't that the part? I know each of us have had experiences of being one of the first or the only Indigenous women in the room. And I'm so tired of it. Honestly,
Yeah.
I'm kind of over it. And I think one of the things we were talking before is about how over it I am about having the first discussion of the beginning conversation. I'm ready to move past the beginning conversation that Indigenous people exist, therefore we have inherent rights, and those rights have meaning. I am over it. There's a quote by, I think it was Toni Morrison, that says about racism that the real meaning, the real purpose of racism is to distract us. First, they say we have no language, so we spend 20 years proving that we do. And then they say that we have no culture, and then they say that we have no land. And so we're constantly in a position of having to prove to others through systemic racism that we exist. And that has value and inherent rights, and those rights have meaning. And I'm so ready for the next piece, if that makes sense. Does that make, like...
It makes perfect sense. I mean, I think that I was telling you that I have been involved, you know, in a small project where I was invited with a few other folks from across the country. Everyone else is non-Indigenous in this process. There's 4 of us, but to write sort of a visioning paper for the Department of Justice, to talk to them about what their policy concern should be in the next 3 to 5 years. And it's a great process. I'm really glad that they're doing this. It's totally different. It's unique, you know, where we're invited to write a policy paper to basically tell them what should they be looking at, what should they be concerned about. And frankly, what I wrote to them was everything you've heard for the last, you know, 100 years that we've been saying, right? That we have sovereignty as Indigenous people, that we have inherent jurisdiction, that we are people, that you don't define us, that we have our own laws, and that until all of those things are recognized, we are simply not going to be able to engage in the same conversation, because every time we have to come to these tables and prove that we exist, we get nowhere.
There's this term that came up while we were developing the legislation, and it came through the concrete actions and the vision and guiding principle about legal pluralism. There are these other systems of law that exist, because we think of law as being so universal and it's supposed to be neutral, and it is supposed to apply justly to all, as if somehow we didn't create it, and therefore all of the things that are intrinsic to humans, including oppression and racism and homophobia, etc., aren't therefore present within the actual law. And so to come at it from like, there are these other ways of knowing, there are these other ways of practicing justice, of educating, of raising families, of being connected, is somehow afforded to so many different communities until we get to Indigenous women, until we get to Indigenous people, that we come back to that proving state. When the whole foundation of proving our existence when talking about law is just so frustrating, lack of a better word, frustrating. It's offensive. So what do we do about it? What do we do about it? Do we abandon everything? I know that for me, the part why I want to do this series and why I'm so excited to have this conversation is that I am ready for the next step. I am ready for, can't remember who said it first, but this was one of our minister's mantras, is doing constructive damage to the status quo. I believe that there are so many things about what we have right now that do not serve us. And we accept them as truth, as if we didn't build them. I like the idea of taking out all of the pieces, even the ones that we think serve us, and rebuilding in a new fashion. That to me is hopeful. And it's so contrary to most policy or law that the thing that we need to do is actually start over. And that's what I hear from what you're sharing, is that starting over.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things that I talked about in the context of starting over, because I said, you know, you really just need to scrap this whole system. I mean, literally scrap it. And I mean, start all over. Was that the heart of moving forward is relationships, right? And that until we're willing to build relationships in ways that truly acknowledge one another, and by that I meant them acknowledging us, really. To be clear.
That's for the purposes of this discussion. It's our table. It's us acknowledging them. It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah.
So.
That we're just not going to get anywhere. And, you know, there was this profound moment where somebody said at the end of the conversation that as a public servant, they recognized for the first time that in their work, and it wasn't just from my paper, it was obviously there were 3 other people presenting, and we had this huge conversation, but that they recognized that as a public servant, working for government, working for the Department of Justice, that they had accountability as a person in the work that they did, that work wasn't just like punching a clock, coming in and out every day and doing things that they were told to do because they were told to do them. That in that they had responsibility to the people that they were impacting, and that they were accountable. And, you know, I think to myself, great. On the one hand, that's wonderful. Like, this revelation is fantastic, but
Horrifying.
It's horrifying. It's horrifying. And if that's the starting place, if we're not even at that place yet, how do we begin to build those relationships? you know? And I want to go back to something you said about being the first, because there's an amazing quote from Christine Zuni Cruz, who's a legal educator and lawyer in the US. And she, anyway, she said on being first, and I'll just quote her here because I just think it's so important, right? Being first and the attached significance to being first, when firstness is attached to your ethnicity and color, says more about our societies and our institutions than it says about first persons. These firsts, whether that experienced by, and she's talking about Mr. Belafontaine, or that experienced by Mr. Powell, because she's talking about earlier examples she's used, reflect on the racism and discrimination that exist, be it in the hotel, the state of Florida, or the institutions and the government of this country, right? So it's not at all about our fitness, she says, as first people, and being first at these tables, being first in these conversations. It's really about the systems that have kept us from being here until now, and that also continue to see us as first. And often, sadly, when somebody is seen as first, they also end up being last, right?
Oh, yes, and the dehumanizing aspect of the fact that we're actually trying to get recognition for first peoples as like an entire nation, and yet being first to be in these roles is what is focused on, rather than the significant part of that is being our inherent indigeneity in connection to being first on the lands. It's okay and celebrated to be first to enter into these colonial roles of power. But what is that connection then to being first on the territory, to being first to have law on this territory, to be first to have practice and policy and insight and interest here? That piece, though, I want to go back to the piece about public service, because I'm a public servant. And I think that that is something that is intrinsic and follows our teachings, that if you can be of service, you choose to do so. And how much I respect public service. I'm a public servant. I believe in the power of policy. I believe that the intrinsic nature, even the oaths we take, are to be of service. I think the challenge with that is so often we are in service to political leadership rather than people. And that has to do with systemic structures. It has to do with systemic racism, that even if now being of service, what you're talking about is even if the individuals themselves are not racist, let's assume not, that the system itself will continue to perpetuate not only the erasing of their own humanity and accountability, but that it will continue to oppress. That's what the systemic racism does. And that's what we have the ability through policy and law and as people to change, because it's our policy, it's our law, it's our system. So this is where I think that with that realization, because everybody has to go through it, like if they're not seeing themselves being in a role of accountability or in a role of authority or in a role of leadership, and yet they are the decision makers that have impacts on Indigenous people, then they do have that responsibility and that power and that authority. We want them to have those realizations. It's just so shocking and uncomfortable that it has to come so late in a career rather than in school or elementary school.
Yeah, and so, I mean, so late in a career that comes following so many monumental recent events. And I mean, there have been many monumental events through the history of the Canadian state in terms of like Indigenous settler relations and legal relations. But, you know, following the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's, you know, events and calls to action, the fact that we have, you know, all kinds of, you know, and I'll put them in air quotes, but like TRC statements and TRC commitments out there. People have TRC mandates, including government. We've heard plenty from federal, provincial, and territorial governments about their commitments to truth and reconciliation over the last number of years. So for a public servant who comes in an era of what is supposed to be a commitment to truth and reconciliation, to not have had a conversation before that has awakened them to the notion that they are something more than a cog in a machine, basically, right? Somebody who just goes to work and does what they're told without thinking about the way that does impact other people. And I mean, I'm not trying to dismiss this person's profound revelation, because I do think for them that it was, and I do think that's amazing. And I just would hope that people would be having this profound revelation all the time, right? And I see this in law constantly, right? That people are having revelations about what it means to be, working with Indigenous people in the context of law and legal policy, and yet they cannot seem to move past the bureaucratic oppression of the institution itself, and actually just shifting the narrative and creating change, and not recognizing that they have power to do that, right? And that it's not just about, it's about the system, of course, but they are the system, right? And within it, they have an individual voice and accountability and responsibility, and also choice, right? And I think that you and I both saw this a lot when we worked at the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement process, right? That we saw individuals in that process make choices that we just thought were incomprehensible.
So they were incomprehensible, and there wasn't even, because we're going there. There wasn't even a consideration of what it would mean for Indigenous people to work as part of that system. And for those of you that don't know, before the TRC, before we have a little book that you can carry in your pocket, there were all of these hearings. It was a class action suit, and 1.5 million records. I had a caseload of 3,000. There was nothing in place for Indigenous people in this process to even be employees, of how to support them. And there were all of these hearings that in the common experience payment that associated that if you confirmed that you were a student at one of the official residential schools, you were entitled to a certain amount of payment for your first year and for each year thereafter. In the independent assessment process, you were entitled to compensation if you could prove, and the standard was not even 50%, that you had experienced abuse of any kind, and it was rated. There was a chart. And there were thousands of hearings through the independent assessment process that predated the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's public hearings. These were legal processes held in hotels and hotel boardrooms and in legal offices and in meeting rooms all over the country to evaluate the entitlements to compensation for your experience at residential school. And that's the content that we worked with. And there was absolutely, the defendant in that class action suit was the one who became in charge of the settlement agreement. The Department of Indian Affairs was now in charge of the actual settlement where they were found culpable. And provinces were not signatories to that agreement. Canada was, some churches were, and that was it. Provinces were not part of that. And to be in that, I mean, I don't know about for you, that left a profound, you went to law school. I avoided law after that, after being part of a legal process. And I felt like I had again, the end of a dragon by a tail, hoping it didn't turn around. There were so many decisions made in there where, and there was such a dark humor and vicarious trauma that happened, that people treated it as if that trope about taxpayers' money.
Yeah.
That was survivors' money. As if somehow taxpayers and Indigenous people and survivors of residential school must be diametrically opposed in their interests. And that is the thing about public service that gets me, is that we are here to serve the public, all the constituents, whether or not they agree with government or not. Indigenous interests in this province are government's interests. Indigenous interests in this country are Canada's interests. We are here to serve all.
Absolutely.
And if we marginalize anybody in our law, in our policy, in our practice, if we marginalize ourselves, if we allow for that to happen, we do a disservice to everybody. One of the things that I found so profound at that time, and like I said, you went towards law and I went away from it. And then I was in charge of writing a law, is how...
Yeah, so not really that far away from it, are you?
What I found in this, which I don't know about your experience and I'm interested in, is through the experience of working with Indigenous people and that legal pluralism, to recognize the humanity of Indigenous people here. What got me was that, from my perspective, and I don't know what this is like for you, but there was an element of the sacred in there. This is supposed to be, law should be the best example. Policy leads to law and vice versa. They're interconnected. What they are all is beliefs of how we should carry ourselves to the best of our ability, and the methodology in which to do so. But there's an element there of the sacred. When we talk about law in Smalgiak, when we talk about our adak in the Gitxsan, when we talk about our laws, they're sacred. Just like the honor of the crown is sacred here. Mm-hmm. There is an element there that I absolutely believe touches on that deeper part of our spirit, our shared humanity, and that can be articulated. And I didn't know that, because coming through the residential school settlement agreement and that whole process, I could only see law as something to oppress and dehumanize. I was wrong. Most of the time. But for that one, it was a hard... Law has been symbolic for me. Law and policy has been symbolic of me for most of my life, being registered under the Indian Act as an oppressive tool. Mm-hmm. I never thought of it as a way to emancipate or explore the sacred, or as being part of our inheritance. I don't know what that's been like for you. We haven't actually talked about that. So if you don't want to talk about the sacred.
No, of course I do.
In a Zoom call.
We're talking about dreaming and sovereignty and matriation. So, I mean, the sacred's at the heart of it, right? At the end of the day.
Yes.
So yeah, law is profoundly sacred. And I think it is in any society, in the sense that the law is, exactly as you've said, the way that we structure our world in order that it makes sense, right? In order that it reflects the values that we want to carry individually and collectively together in our worlds. And so the idea that somehow law is divorced from us, and then even far removed as policy, is ridiculous, frankly, right? And this is why you see the power of law when it can be used to dismantle oppression. And in the common law, precedent is an amazing thing, because it can be used to move forward new objectives. And I tell my students all the time, like, you will have the opportunity to make the law, to make law, and that is a sacred and selfless act, or it should be. Because what you are doing is you are holding up what is best about our society and what should be best. And again, to go back to your, your statement just a few minutes ago, for all of us, right? So the idea that that somehow should not include, Indigenous people or other marginalized folks in whatever positionalities they find themselves is, is completely contradictory to what we believe in ourselves as a society. Right? So when you're standing in front of a judge and you want to talk about somebody's Gladue rights, let's say, right? So the ways in which Indigenous people's experiences of colonialism have to be taken into account by the court. Lots of people would say only in the criminal context. I would argue otherwise, but that's not really the point.
But isn't that the point? Isn't
Yes.
the context in which we exist, like, isn't that I want to hear more about your experience with Gladue, because I make the statement, I've never had to write a report. I've never had to share that context. And why? So I think irrelevant and all, but I want to, sorry, I interrupted you to ask you to tell me more about that.
Yeah, no, it is a profound invocation, right, of the sacred, because we are talking about somebody's life and bringing to light the ways in which their experience has led them to, at the end of the day, what is, and I don't say this because it's inevitable in them, in their inherent being. That's, I go back to Zuni Cruz's point, where it's not about us, it's actually about the system that's been created. Right? So when an Indigenous person is standing in a criminal court, let's say, they are there because colonialism has wanted them to be there. They are there because the system has created all of the ways in which they end up there, because that is not about them. It's about what's happened around them. It's about intergenerational injustice. It's about the fact that all the ways that we tell the court that they and their families and their nations and their communities have experienced colonialism have led them to this place. And although within that, of course, there's still discussion about accountability and responsibility for that person, it doesn't change the fact that the invocation of what is right is a recognition of the ways that that person ended up there, because that was the path set before them through all of the, we talk about risk assessment all the time, but really in criminal law, people talk about this, but really the risk for Indigenous people is the system, right? It's the colonial state. It's the things that they encounter that colonialism has been created to impose, literally, on people. And so all of that is brought before the court, and hopefully, if you've been trained to do it properly, I think too, all of the ways in which that person is resilient, and all of the ways in which their community and their nation and their family has survived and persevered through all of that. And the fact that they are standing there and they are not dead, right? That they are alive and they are an Indigenous person, and that they are strong and they are resilient, and that they choose life every day in a system that wants, I'm not being overly dramatic when I say this, in a system that wants them dead. Right?
Oh, I don't think you're being overly dramatic.
Genocide.
Any part of the system, I think, health, justice, enforcement, land, resources. The odds of either one of us being here and holding this space is more rare than one of us experiencing fatal violence or fatal oppression. And but the part that you're talking about the context and the resilience that therefore is required. It's everything. It's absolutely everything. And I think any community can experience this. I think this is the part about where it's not like somebody self-actualized into this moment. And this is all the choices they would make for themselves, given the hand that we're dealt. And that comes back to the leadership that is required. The leadership that is required to be recognized, the resilience that is required to be recognized, to champion those voices as being central, that the justice that you're seeking through that Gladue report, through that process, is not just so the system, but it's that person needs to experience justice based on them, that they have an invested relationship with their experience and how it comes out, and what that resiliency looks like in that moment is valid. And I'm so interested in that resilience and that leadership. There are so many things about what has brought us to this moment that we didn't start, that we didn't put into play, and that we're doing now that will live on long after we're gone and is going to go on and do its own work.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested in that. I'm interested in that resilience. I'm interested in how we champion people to speak for themselves, particularly the most marginalized, particularly those that are systemically put in positions to not be able to advocate for themselves, to be criminalized, to be dehumanized, to be legislated into such a corner that your identity is often criminal. Your existence is often criminal. Your resilience is suspect. I'm interested in that part because I don't want to be the first and I don't want to be the only. It's boring. It's lonely.
Yeah.
And I don't want this to be revolutionary, to have matriarchs speaking about our experiences and our leadership. And I don't always want it to be in reference to a non-Indigenous law, into a non-Indigenous experience, into a non-Indigenous approach to policy and governance and economy and health and science. I like that piece on resilience, and we all have an element of that. That is our inheritance, not poverty, not criminalization, not oppression, resilience. Those other things that we experience, we're not very good at either. We're not very good at poverty. It's a very new experience. We're not good at it.
Yeah, I think that I love the particular phrase you've used in that being our inheritance. I think that is so true, and I think it's why we struggle, in the best possible way, fight, if you will, so hard
Rail
as Indigenous
against
people.
the machine.
because that is our inheritance, right? And when we talk about sovereignty, when we talk about inherent jurisdiction, we're talking about the land, obviously, but we're not just talking about the land.
Mm-hmm.
We're not just talking about territory. We're talking about our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about our ancestral knowledge. We're talking about our sacred laws and practices, right? We are talking about all the ways in which we are sovereign in our lands, and, as particular to territories. But that is so much bigger than, a notion enshrined in section, 35. It's so much bigger than something that the Supreme Court of Canada can allegedly grant to us, even though we never gave it away.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And, I think that the way that we begin to break down the barriers, and maybe, I mean, maybe that's what matriation's really about in lots of ways, is maybe we're just getting to the place where we can do that because we are just able to sit at these tables. And maybe that's why it matters so much that we are. And, you know, you, despite being, you know, repelled by law.
I was.
End up
Feeling
writing
a bit
it,
better
you know.
about it. But the law that we were writing is within the provincial system. We already have our adak. We already have our sacred laws, and they're valid. And that's that piece about legal pluralism.
Yeah.
That I think is so beautiful and blew my mind. And now, you know, the UVic law program having, you know, a dual recognition in jurisprudence, both legal and Indigenous, rather than just having like Indigenous law as a subsect of common law, Canadian common law, that it's its own actual valid and pursuable component of law. That we wrote it in English and we wrote it for the BC context, but it's what it is making room for. It's making space. It's making space for what already exists and for Indigenous governance and law and policy and practice to enter.
Absolutely. Which isn't a complicated notion. Right? Like that pluralism is not a complicated notion. In fact, we have it already in this country, right? Like Quebec has its own legal system. This is not a difficult thing to do. And
so
the notion that it is, well, that's what colonialism wants people to believe, right? Like that's
just it. So
thing.
where else are we wrong? Where else is the colonial system wrong? You know, somehow that's that part about proving that we have law, that it exists, and that we have value. And that's the part that's so exciting. So before we flip to questions, I do want to touch on something that you said to me recently, which was about emotional labor.
Yeah, so I was in a meeting of Indigenous women from across the country who were trying to get some work done. I was going to say other words, but I'm not. Anyways, and Dr. Tracy Lindbergh, I believe it was, said, you know, because we were talking about emotional labor and the ways that this work affects women differently. And she was like, you know, and I'm paraphrasing poorly here probably at this point in time, but she said words to the effect of, I'm so tired of people calling this work emotional labor. This is leadership work, and women are doing it, and women have always been doing it, right? Like we didn't stop doing it. We never put down the work. Like it's always been happening. It's always been ignored. And then when they can't ignore it, they call it emotional labor, but it's not. It's leadership work. And I thought that was so profoundly important, because it's true. and you know, I know that in my heart, of course, and I know it intellectually, but to actually use the words and acknowledge it whenever I see it happening makes a huge difference. And so I have been, whenever I see it happening now everywhere around us, I say, thank you. Thank you, Jessica, for inviting me to the table tonight to do this important leadership work with you. Thank you for your leadership work at these tables all the time, because it's so important and significant for us to value that in a way that it is not being valued. Right?
Or compensated. That's the other part. Yeah. I think I agree, and I want to take it one step further, is that the difference between leadership and emotional labor, of course, is that recognition, but the other is compensation, that these are valid skills that should be commensurate with leadership and paid accordingly. Absolutely. I am tired of the unpaid labor of BIPOC people, of Indigenous women, to educate and have those beginning conversations when we're ready to go. I think the other part where that comes in is around the feminist notion of gender equity, which is trying to be achieved still in so many ways in our society, Canadian, American, global, that is trying to be achieved for the first time. But as Indigenous women, we're trying to reclaim what we already had. We have a lived experience and history of matriation.
Yeah.
We have an experience of leadership in a way that other communities have never experienced for the first time, and we are reclaiming. And I think that's a really important distinction. On that note, I believe there are things that are flashing and suggesting that now would be a good time for questions. Are you ready to engage?
Totally. Let's do
Tamara,
it.
do you want to help us out? All right, I'm pressing
Sure.
buttons. Thank you.
The first question that had come in from Asta was, how do we work to dismantle the bureaucratic oppression?
Yeah. So
Hire
my
Indigenous women.
perspective, exactly. Yeah. No, seriously. I was in, what was it? It was the provincial roundtable on racism or anti-racism. I can't remember how they named it recently during COVID times. They had all these roundtables. I spoke at the roundtable on racism. And, you know, somebody asked a question sort of about how do we get more BIPOC people in the, you know, in the systems, right? And my fellow panelists said, hire them. And they were like, oh, yeah, hire them. Yeah, hire them. Like, and then he gently reminded people, like, and it's not that they're not applying, but you got to hire them. You've got to recognize the ways that, like you just said, Jessica, you have to recognize the skills, right? You have to recognize the importance of the things that are being brought to the table and bring those people into the conversation, right? You need to recognize that potentially if you're going to hire in a university for an Indigenous position, you probably need to not be insistent that that person has a PhD, because actually the number of Indigenous people with PhDs, although it's way more than it used to be, is still really, 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 really tiny. And so you immediately restrict the number of people who can apply and who are qualified. You know, although as an Indigenous elder said to me one time when we were on a hiring panel, she was like, what about the PhD this person has in their, you know, in their culture?
That's right.
Because that's so important, but it's not recognized.
There are some things about the bureaucracy and systemic racism where I feel like I have some insight. So I appreciate the question. Batch hiring, hire Indigenous people, hire BIPOC people. It's, you're watching some universities do collective hires, because that's also how you create safe space. I may be the first or the only in the room, but I do everything I can to ensure that I'm not the last. And I think that there's a point of coming into public service, but I think you also need to do that in a cohort for it to be sustainable. Also, I think systemically, we need to instill more accountability to interrupt those decisions and those processes and that approach that public servant has been under the misapprehension that they were not individually accountable. I think that in itself, and that's why there's such accountability built into the law that we passed, so that it is not a policy decision where policy isn't followed, or it's a methodology, or it can be changed. And that's how you get an incredible number of people to change their processes at once, right? So that's my approach. That's what I champion. It is difficult. It is difficult. And I agree with you in terms of how we recognize leadership experience in our hiring. You can have been an elected or hereditary leader for your nation and not be considered having management experience.
Yeah.
And I blink incredulously because it's so common. I think we may have,
one more question, which will
yes, get us in
take
there
all the
because we'll
time.
just keep going.
Okay. So from Jessica Mayhew, she says, I have learned in colonial law school that Canada is an oppressive ideology that positions itself as a reality through legalized fictions to uphold white supremacy and corporate wealth. I'm currently on lands that people consider Canada, so that they can justify extracting resources here. How do we share the information we've gained in these colonial institutions in ways that allow people to see the truth so that we can begin to rebuild relationships in a good way? How do we show settlers that Indigenous ways of knowing and being are the norm rather than the other law on these lands where the Canadian state has no legitimate jurisdiction? How do we participate in state systems without giving them legitimacy? The legitimacy they claim to have? I keep coming to the conclusion that we need to turn away from them entirely and build them with each other, in addition to mitigating risks and doing harm reduction within them. And in 4 minutes, if you can reply to that masterclass, that would be great.
All the days I wish I had gone to law school. Patricia, do you have any desire to go first on that one?
Sure, and I'll try to keep it quick, Jess, because I want to hear your response to this too. But my short answer is yes. My short answer is yes. We do both of these things. You're right, 100%. We have to turn away and build with each other, because until somebody's going to recognize us, acknowledge us, and see our sovereignty, our jurisdiction, the fact that we are, and that is enough in its entirety, we're not going to be able to do the things that we want to do. So I think that we do the things that we want to do, and then also we have to work in those systems, and some of us do, and work to teach and educate and break them down. And I think that, I talk to my students about this all the time, the differences between like doing the work of settler harm reduction in terms of law and legal processes, decolonizing where we can and how we can within those systems. But then indigenization for me is outside of those systems, where we're doing the work that brings us as Indigenous people into these conversations like this one tonight, where we're talking past those other conversations and saying like, there are more important things we need to be talking about. And if they're not going to listen to us, we're just going to keep talking and doing things about them like we have been since the beginning of this process, right?
I agree with you on the multiple. We need the multiple approaches. None of these tactics are wrong. Where I think the question centers on for me is, what do we as individuals do? Do we invest in our community and our governance? Absolutely. Do we also interrupt and reject oppression by any state actor? Absolutely. I think that this is where that legal pluralism comes in, that there is progress to be made, and it has to be done with accountability. We have to keep increasing accountability, and not in the historic wrong way that often is part of the dismantling of that argument, but accountability now for not historic harms, but the harms that continue. We can deal with the historic harms after we stop doing the harm. And there are things that are systemically built into our governance that must be interrupted. They have to be interrupted. So I think that investment is a challenging one, to be able to balance, to be able to nurture, to be able to prioritize. And yet it is our existence. I think that it is the task at hand, and it is what Matriation has been doing since contact. I believe that we no longer need to invest in systems that harm us, but we do need to respond and prevent and interrupt the harm from happening. And we need to dismantle that from being able to continue. Absolutely. And our experience of colonization is still very recent in the history of our experience as Indigenous people. And we have the teachings and we have the examples we can and are rebuilding and reclaiming and asserting those rights. And that's the part about inherent rights, is that for them to be respected, they must be asserted. We must respect them ourselves. We must act upon them. We must find value in them for ourselves. And that is where we will be able to assert our boundaries. That is where we will be able to make progress. If we respect them for ourselves, if we find them and articulate them and share them amongst ourselves and rematriate them in a way in which is accountable and is shared and is beautiful. And there won't be any arguing with it because there will be nobody there to argue against it. When we assert ourselves for ourselves in ways that are beautiful and safe and respect our own humanity. So I saw a flash. I don't want to stop talking with you, Patricia. I'm going to call you after this. I want to thank you so much for joining me today, and in all the shared adventures that we've had, and trying to be able to find the words to articulate what sovereignty and matriation and Indigenous identity mean in this era, in the largest civil rights movement in global history, during a time of where reconciliation is actually a word, where Indigenous people are the lawmakers. And I appreciate so much of our journeys crossing together over the years. I want to thank you so much for coming today, for your Métis Matriarch wisdom, and for everything that you contribute, for your work with the Law Society, for your work at the school. I appreciate your contribution and your sharing and your thoughts, and settler harm reduction will make its way now forevermore into my vocabulary. And I appreciate that. I want to thank Allison McFarlane, Tamara Baldwin, Tina Alexander, and Lindsay March for helping make tonight the first of our 5-part series possible. Our next one will be on November 23rd with Brenda Butterworth Carr on the theme of safety and matriation. And I thank everybody who joined us tonight for this conversation and for bearing witness. And thank you so much for all the questions. Lots more information out there if you'd like to pursue. And Hamia, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Enjoy your tea, enjoy your evening, be well, stay safe. Hamia, thank you.